There is a civilization that invented writing and then became unreadable, not because their texts were destroyed, because their language belongs to nothing. Sumerian, the tongue spoken by the people who built the first cities in human history, who developed the first writing system, who produced the first legal codes and the first love poetry and the first recorded epic, stands alone among all the languages ever studied. It is not related to Semitic languages. It is not related to Indo-European languages. It is not related to any other language family identified anywhere on Earth.
It widens.
Linguists call it a language isolate, and they have been trying for over a century to find its relatives, its cousins, its ancestors, any linguistic connection that would place it in a recognizable family tree. They have found nothing. And the silence of that search is not for lack of effort. It is because, as far as the evidence can tell, Sumerian has no living or dead relatives anywhere in the world. This was just the language. The people who spoke it present an equally perplexing picture. The Sumerians appeared in the archaeological record of southern Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers in what is today southern Iraq, sometime around 4500 BCE. They built the world's first cities, Eridu, which the Sumerians themselves considered the oldest city on Earth, its founding described in their own creation literature as the moment civilization began.
To find the truth.
Uruk, which by 3000 BCE had grown to a population of perhaps 50,000 people, the largest human settlement that had ever existed, surrounded by a wall that Gilgamesh himself, according to the epic that bears his name, built with his own hands. Whose royal cemetery produced some of the most extraordinary examples of ancient craftsmanship ever recovered by archaeologists. Gold and lapis lazuli and carnelian assembled, with a precision that suggests not just skill, but an entire economic system capable of acquiring rare materials from sources hundreds of miles distant. They developed cylinder seals, irrigation systems, monumental architecture, and a bureaucratic system complex enough to require a writing system to manage it. The writing, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus, began as a record-keeping tool, a way of tracking grain and livestock and labor obligations across a complex administrative system. It became, within a few centuries, the medium for law codes and hymns and mathematical tables, and the earliest surviving work of narrative literature in human history. They produced administrators and priests and merchants and farmers and soldiers in proportions that imply a level of social organization that had never existed before anywhere on Earth. And then, by roughly 2000 BCE, they were gone, absorbed into the Akkadian-speaking Semitic populations that had been living alongside them for centuries, leaving behind their writing system, which the Akkadians adopted and used for another 2000 years, and their language, which became a dead language used only by scholars and priests before disappearing entirely from the mouths of living speakers. For most of the history of Mesopotamian scholarship, the question of where the Sumerians came from was treated as essentially unanswerable. The ancient sources offered no clear account of a migration or an origin point. The Sumerians themselves referred to their land as Kai-Engi, the land of the civilized lords, in ways that implied deep-rootedness rather than recent arrival. Some scholars proposed that they had come from the east, from Central Asia or the Iranian plateau. Others argued for an African origin. Others maintained that they were the indigenous population of southern Mesopotamia, evolved in place from earlier Neolithic farming communities. The debate produced more heat than resolution across more than a century of scholarship. And then the ancient DNA arrived, slowly, imperfectly, and with significant limitations that the specific conditions of Mesopotamian burial sites imposed on the researchers attempting to extract it. The problem with ancient DNA from Mesopotamia is a familiar one to anyone who has followed the progress of this field across the past 2 decades. Southern Iraq is hot. It is humid in the river valleys where the Sumerian cities were built. The conditions that are ideal for mud brick construction and for the preservation of clay tablets bearing cuneiform inscriptions are catastrophically bad for the preservation of organic material, including bone, and the DNA within it. The ancient DNA revolution that transformed understanding of European prehistory, of the peopling of the Americas, of the deep history of East and Southeast Asia, has been significantly slower to reach Mesopotamia for the simple reason that the material is harder to work with. The genomes that have been recovered are fewer, more fragmentary, and more uncertain in their interpretation than what researchers working with better preserved material from colder, drier environments have been able to produce. What has been recovered, however, is enough to begin asking some specific questions about the people who built the world's first cities, and the answers that have started to emerge do not simplify the picture. A study published in 2019 and subsequent work building on it analyzed ancient genomic data from individuals buried at sites in the broader Fertile Crescent region, spanning the Neolithic through the early Bronze Age, including material from sites in what is today Iraq and Iran that was associated with a period immediately preceding and contemporaneous with the rise of Sumerian civilization. The genetic picture that emerged showed that the population of southern Mesopotamia during the critical period of Sumerian cultural emergence was the product of a mixture between two distinct ancestry streams. The first was the Anatolian Neolithic farmer ancestry that characterizes most ancient Middle Eastern populations from the same period, the same western stream of Neolithic ancestry whose descendants show up across the ancient Mediterranean and into Europe. The second was a more eastern component, related to populations from the Iranian plateau and the broader Zagros mountain region, that contributed significantly to the ancestry of southern Mesopotamian individuals in ways that distinguished them from populations further to the west and north. This Eastern Iranian plateau-related ancestry component is one of the most interesting findings in the Mesopotamian ancient DNA data, not because it is unexpected in a general sense, but because its specific distribution in the ancient population raises questions about the timing and nature of the population movements that produced the Sumerian civilization. The people who appear in the genetic record at the moment when Sumerian cultural complexity was emerging were already a mixed population, but the specific mixture they represented, with its relatively strong Iranian plateau component, differs from what the populations to the west and north showed at the same period. What this means for the origin question is complex. It does not clearly support the hypothesis that the Sumerians arrived as a coherent outside group from a specific origin point. The genetic profile is consistent with a long-established mixed population rather than a recent migration. But it does show that the population of southern Mesopotamia was genetically distinct from the surrounding regions in ways that correlate with the linguistic and cultural distinctiveness that made the Sumerians so puzzling in the first place. The people who invented writing were also, in their genetic makeup, somewhat different from their neighbors. Whether that difference caused the cultural achievement, contributed to it, or is simply a coincidence of the data, is a question the genetics cannot currently answer. And here is where the Sumerian story connects to a pattern that keeps appearing across the ancient DNA research, wherever it touches the great civilizational breakthroughs of human prehistory. The innovations that define civilization, writing law, monumental architecture, long-distance trade, bureaucratic administration, do not appear to emerge from a single genetically homogeneous population with a clean and traceable origin. They emerge from zones of contact and mixture, places where populations with different ancestries and different technological and cultural traditions were in sustained interaction. Southern Mesopotamia in the 5th and 4th millennia BCE was precisely such a zone. The river valleys between the Tigris and Euphrates drew populations from multiple directions. Farmers from the north and west bringing one set of traditions, herders and traders from the Iranian plateau bringing another. The specific mixture of these streams, in a landscape of extraordinary agricultural productivity once irrigation was mastered, may have been the catalyst for the cultural explosion we call Sumerian civilization, rather than the product of a single people arriving from a single place with a pre-existing genius for complexity. The language isolate problem remains unsolved by the genetics. Ancient DNA can tell us about population movements and admixtures. It cannot tell us why a specific language showed up in a specific place with no recoverable relatives anywhere in the world. The most common current hypothesis is that Sumerian was the language of one of the founding population streams that contributed to the mixed Mesopotamian population, and that the specific demographic dynamics of the Sumerian period, in which the Sumerian-speaking population was small relative to the broader population, but disproportionately influential in urban, administrative, and religious contexts, allowed the language to become the prestige tongue of the civilization while its closest relatives, spoken by smaller and less politically organized groups, died out without leaving recoverable traces. This hypothesis is plausible. It is also unprovable with current evidence. The Sumerians left us their writing. They left us their cities, whose ruins still emerge from the desert of southern Iraq when archaeologists dig in the right places. Mud brick walls that have survived 5,000 years in soil that destroys almost everything organic. They left us their mathematics, the base 60 numerical system. That is why we still divide hours into 60 minutes and circles into 360 degrees. A system so efficient that it was never replaced across 5,000 years of mathematical development. They left us their Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest sustained narrative in human literature, a story about a king who was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who watched his closest companion die and could not accept mortality, who traveled to the ends of the earth seeking the secret of eternal life and did not find it, and who returned finally to his city and looked at its walls and found in the permanence of what he had built a kind of consolation for the impermanence of his own life. They did not leave us a clear account of where they came from. The DNA is beginning to provide the outline of an answer to that question. Not a clean answer. Not a simple story of a single people arriving from a single place with a fully formed genius for complexity, but the beginning of a picture of a mixed population in a productive river valley, drawing on multiple ancestry streams and multiple cultural traditions, producing in the specific conditions of that mixture something that no prior human society had managed. A city, a script, a law, a story. The genetics are telling us that the people who changed everything were never simply one thing. They were, like every population that has ever produced something extraordinary, the product of more than one world coming together in a specific place, at a specific time and finding, in that meeting, possibilities that neither world had been able to see alone. And what came out of that meeting, cut into clay tablets that have survived 5,000 years in the soil of southern Iraq and are still being read by scholars in university offices around the world, is the oldest surviving evidence we have of what happens when human beings decide, for the first time, to write things down.